Hello, everyone, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center and also the Asia Program Deputy Director at the Wilson Center. The focus of our discussion today will be on the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. This is a relationship that has had its share of highs and lows over the years. There have been periods of considerable cooperation, including during the Cold War, and more recently in the immediate post-9/11 period. But there have also been periods of great tension, including during a period in 2011 and 2012. Since US forces entered Afghanistan in 2001, the US-Pakistan relationship has largely been shaped by developments in Afghanistan and the war there. This has entailed cooperation ranging from targeting al-Qaeda terrorists to pursuing negotiations with the Taliban. But it has also entailed a lot of tension rooted in factors such as Pakistan's support for terror groups that target Americans in Afghanistan, as well as US covert activities in Pakistan. So with US troops leaving Afghanistan and the US footprint in the country set to recede, the US-Pakistan relationship is at an inflection point. Its future is uncertain. Islamabad wants to reorient the relationship and focus it more on non-Afghanistan and non-security related issues. Washington, even as it withdraws from Afghanistan, does continue to prioritize Afghanistan-related issues, such as seeking to build a counterterrorism capacity in Afghanistan without troops on the ground, and attempting to advance a very fragile intra-Afghan dialogue. And the US does see Pakistan figuring in these objectives in some way. But still, President Biden has made quite clear that he wants US foreign policy to focus less on Afghanistan and more on what he views as key priorities elsewhere. Serious terrorism threats in other areas of the world, strategic competition with China, and growing global threats like climate change. So Afghanistan arguably will not be a central US foreign policy issue for much longer. And this has implications for a US-Pakistan relationship that has been tethered to Afghanistan for a long time. So today we're going to dig into the future of US-Pakistan relations and look at what factors might help us understand its likely direction in the coming months. We'll discuss to what extent Afghanistan will remain a key focus of the relationship, what are some potential new anchors for the relationship, and more broadly, what is the healthiest way or the most constructive way to frame the relationship post-US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And to help us work through these complex questions, we've assembled a great panel of US experts. All of them have worked on Pakistan and the US government on different levels, in different capacities, and at different times. They've all served either during the Trump administration or the Obama administration. And the panelist bios should be posted on the event page that this event is streaming from, so I'll be brief in my introductions. We're delighted to have with us, first of all, Ambassador David Hale, who is a distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Wilson Center. He was, as many will know, previously US Ambassador to Pakistan. His most recent position was Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and his other past positions include Ambassador to Lebanon and Special Envoy for Middle East Peace. Nadia Naviwalla is a Wilson Center Global Fellow, so another Wilson Center colleague, and an independent researcher and writer. She previously worked in Islamabad as Pakistan country representative for the US Institute of Peace, and before that she was a Pakistan desk officer at USAID and a national security aide in the US Senate. Tamanna Salikuddin is Director of South Asia Programs at the US Institute of Peace. She joined USIP after 12 years in the US government. Her positions included Senior Advisor to the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the State Department and Director for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the National Security Council. And finally, James Schwemlein is a Senior Director with Albright Stonebridge Group and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment. He previously served at the World Bank and the State Department, and at State he was a trade policy officer and also a senior advisor to the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, where his focus included, among other things, US development and economic programs. So in just a moment, I'll invite each panelist to offer several brief few minutes worth of opening comments, and then I'll pose a few questions to them before we go to a Q&A with you, the audience. If you have a question for one or more of the speakers, please either email it to asia@wilsoncenter.org or submit it on Twitter by tagging Asia Program, Program. please indicate to which speaker or speakers your question is addressed, and please let us know your name and affiliation if you wish. So with no further ado, no one tuned in to hear me. I wanted to hear our distinguished panelists. So let's get started. And we will begin with you, Ambassador Hale. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone tuned in. Let me just first open by saying thank you, of course, for including me in this. I'm on loan to the Wilson Center from the State Department. I'm still an employee of the State Department, but I do want to emphasize that I'm speaking today on my own behalf, not for anyone, just based on my own observations over time. To cut quickly to the root question I think you posed, Michael, is whether Afghanistan is likely to remain a central element of our relationship with Pakistan or not, and what will the character of it be? I would say yes. So long as peace and security in Afghanistan matter to the United States, we're going to have to work closely with Pakistan to try to work toward those goals. The risk, in fact, I think in the future is of expecting too much from Pakistan in that regard, and I think we can develop a discussion on that. A second point I'd like to make is that Pakistani leaders will behave in ways they judge best to advance and protect their national security interests as they perceive them. When that approach coincides with what we're trying to do, then a lot can be achieved. But when that's not the case, there is no amount of carrots or sticks that can compel the Pakistanis to behave the way we want them to behave. I would also underscore the role of ISI in Pakistan's military when it comes to developing their national security strategies, including toward Afghanistan. And I would counsel that we try to find common ground while not getting distracted by inevitable differences that will occur. I think it's also important that we address this morning how Pakistanis perceive Afghanistan. Do not look at it in a vacuum. It is in the context of a threatening region and decades of how their national security leadership perceives the tools they need to deal with that threat, with an eye constantly, of course, on India. And I think it's also important that we address this morning how Pakistanis perceive us, the Americans. I know that there is a belief held at the highest levels of the Pakistani military that the United States gets tired of its obligations and commitments and inevitably leaves Pakistan, quote, holding the bag, unquote. I think that there is a lot of mythology to that explanation of things, but it is a very real prism through which Pakistani leaders look at us and the future. They wanted us out of Afghanistan, but not necessarily in the fashion and the speed with which we're doing it today. And of course, we have to ask, what do we want from them, from Pakistan? We want their help in stabilizing a central government in Kabul. We'll want their help in advancing a peace process to termination. We'll need them in countering ISIS and AQ, not just in Afghanistan, but regionally. And I want to underscore, because I know this is in the air and in the media, we do not want military bases, troops on the ground in Pakistan. That has never been part of the equation. So I think that we need to bear in mind key goals and understand that Pakistan's fear is of the TTP Taliban reuniting. And so we need to understand that is going to be again, a prism through which they will be looking at the situation. The more we want Pakistan's help in Afghanistan, the more careful we have to be about how we interact with India when it comes to Afghanistan, which is not to say India does not have important interests in Afghanistan, they do, but we have to understand how these two elements interact. And I would advocate developing strong trilateral mechanisms between Kabul, Washington, and Islamabad to make sure that we're all focused on supporting the central government, and also linkages to Central Asia, which can be very helpful. There's a risk that we need to work to avoid, and that is that the Pakistanis may be inclined, if the situation, the security situation starts to get more difficult in Afghanistan, is to cut local deals with local leaders, which will undercut our longer term goals. And overall, and I realize I'm up against my clock here, but we should neither exaggerate nor underestimate the influence that Pakistan can bear in Afghanistan. And there are two things we want to touch on as well: the refugee issue, which is a potentially huge problem coming up, and the geoeconomic initiative that Pakistan has launched recently. Back to you, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Hale, for some really interesting, insightful opening comments. And I think your point about us or Americans needing to make a better effort to understand where Pakistan is coming from and its perspectives in this broader scenario is really important. I'm glad you brought up the issue about this talk of an intended shift to geoeconomics. So I'm going to talk about that a bit more later. But thank you for that. Let's go now to Nadia. Nadia, over to you.
So I think we're in a really interesting historical moment. Historically, keeping the United States engaged has always been a cornerstone of Pakistani foreign policy in order to balance India. And over the past 10 years, especially, we've seen this shift where because of, I think, well, the big one is China, of course, coming in and the Pakistan sort of realizing or feeling that it can rely on China perhaps more in some ways than the US. Secondly, Pakistan also realizing that it can't compete with the US-India relationship as it once could. What used to be said, even up till the time that I was in government, and between personalities like Charlie Wilson up till David Holbrooke, is that, you know, Pakistanis were known for rolling out the red carpet for US officials when they came in Islamabad, and they could kind of charm their way into confidence with US officials. And at this moment in time, moves like that are no longer relevant or convincing. And I think both sides are ready for kind of a cooling off through this kind of era of a lot of disappointment and frustration on both sides. Another kind of, so I think that, you know, when we talk about the relationship being bigger than security, it's always been one that's been security focused. It's been mill to mill. And on the US side, we've seen Pakistan through the lens of the tribal areas, which for a lot of this period was not even actually a part of Pakistan. And I would liken this to countries basing their foreign policy with the United States and their relationship with the United States based exclusively on what Americans did in Guantanamo. It's very confusing for anyone who's in Pakistan or knows Pakistan more largely to kind of understand this relationship when the underpinning is that narrow. So I would say that it's a bit, given what we've been through over the past 10 years, at this moment, it's logical and reasonable. Things will be focused on Afghanistan because it is a moment of extreme crisis. I think this is where both countries kind of are fine with it being. But I'd be curious about what the other co-panelists think about the prospect of it expanding beyond that and where that expansion can be. The two areas that we've tried over the past 10 years, actually one area that we've tried is aid. And you know, there was something that people don't talk about anymore, the Kerry Lugar-Berman bill, which was a big experiment in balancing the military focused nature of the relationship by expanding it to the civilian government, giving us something to have a relationship about, strengthening the civilian government. And that really didn't work. There's a lot of ways to talk about that, which would be a panel in itself, but I'll say two big things that I think are really important for us to learn in Washington about what goes on with aid in the rest of the world and how to understand it. One is that aid was, even as the second largest program in the world in Pakistan, was too small. It was really small. So for example, the United States talked about its money like it could be transformative. And some of the ambitions were on the scale of, say, of what we thought of with nation building. We wanted to create an alternative to the madrasa system, build 10,000 schools, strengthen the education system, provide electricity, do a lot of really ambitious things. But ultimately the money was probably a few percentage points of what Pakistan's own budgets were for the areas that we were working in. So money could never on its own be transformative. And we lacked the ability to politically engage through our development missions to actually create any kind of transformation. And this is very different from how other countries work with Pakistan, namely the UK, the World Bank, and multilaterals especially as well. And secondly, a lot of Pakistan's development issues are political. And so you can't, there's no way to use trainings or instruction manuals to change the nature of governance, for example, in Pakistan, which is what a lot of our programs ended up trying to do through being projectized and through kind of working in parallel to the systems that were there. So ultimately for Pakistan to become a stable, well-governed country, which is what we always wanted it to be in order to achieve stability in the region. While those problems are at home, the resources are also at home. And I think we could do a lot better by kind of incorporating a lot of things that we learned on a very deep technical level into our political messaging and relationships. So for example, we spent $165 million and spent 7 years on the Pakistan reading program. It was technically very, very sound. And in a lot of ways, it would be transformative to Pakistan, in a country where that does not, where kids spend years in school and cannot read. Educations fundamentally are failing in Pakistan because schools do not teach children in a language that they understand, and there isn't a method for teaching children literacy in these languages. The Pakistan reading program figured out how to do this. They spent, like I said, we spent $165 million on this, but at the end of the day, it was a project that ended. And if we joined up with, say, DFID and the World Bank, and incorporated, had the head of USAID education or the USAID mission director or the US ambassador engaging with ministers and saying, this is what you guys really need to do, we would be in a very different place, and that wouldn't cost money. But I think the US globally is not, that's a very strange and I think radical idea for the US globally to kind of bring together its diplomacy and development missions this way. I think a last point is that when we talk about US-Pakistan relations, it comes down to relationships, and that's really what we're missing. For effective diplomacy and effective aid, you need relationships. And what's happened in Pakistan, I've lived in Pakistan for the last 10 years, a lot of that outside of government, even though I was a former official, and really kind of digging into things as more of a journalist or a researcher. And working with local civil society as well. And what we've seen happen progressively over time is that the Americans have disappeared from Islamabad. We don't know who they are, we don't know where they are. And it's because, contrary to 10 years ago, when the Americans' political officers, public affairs officers were out, they had longstanding relationships with journalists, with other politicians, with analysts in country. It's for reasons not related to US-Pakistan relations and not related to things that create insecurity for Americans. So for example, during the dharnas that happened in Pakistan, the US started pulling back. So now we're in a situation where Americans in Islamabad only deal with other Americans. They live on a brand new embassy compound, which feels like a US university. It has dorms, it has restaurants on campus. It's within a diplomatic enclave, which is only accessible to diplomats. And it's within the most elite sectors of Islamabad. And there isn't any visibility or engagement. A lot of political officers are extremely frustrated and ask, how can we even do our jobs when we can't get out and know anybody? So there is maybe some high level conversation that goes on, but I don't think we can actually understand countries, understand their people, and make really good decisions if we're just going to build walls around ourselves and walls within walls within walls, wherever we are. And it's not just in Pakistan, this is actually happening around the world. And same thing with aid. We can't do it effectively unless we have relationships. And the way that we do things is very different from the way that other countries are using diplomacy and aid as levers for foreign policy. So I think there is something for us to leverage in Pakistan. There is always a proclivity to the United States, and in Pakistan in particular, officials, I think, are personally very Western leaning, and that's what's also created a lot of space for a relationship. But I don't think that we are in a position to leverage it. And while I think we can pin a lot of the instability in Afghanistan on Pakistan, when it comes to other areas of diplomacy and aid, I think that's really on us when it comes to the failure of that.
Well, thank you, Nadia. I assume you had concluded. Really appreciate those opening comments as well. And I think that your your points about relationships, that's really important. Getting to your point, as I understand it, there have been concerns about the short duration of tours time spent in Pakistan, that you have many officials or diplomats, 8 officials who are there. Once they finally get a sense of who to talk to, how things are done, they're out, and then new folks are coming in. I've heard that as being a concern for quite some time as well. So anyway, thank you for that. Let's now go to Tamanna. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Michael, and good to see all the co-panelists here. My name is Tamanna Salikuddin. I'm a director for South Asia programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. But before I came to USIP, I spent a decade or more in the U.S. government. Since 2005, I worked on the U.S.-Pakistan relationships in different parts of the government. And definitely what I've seen is we've tried many different approaches. I was a civil servant in the Bush administration, in the Obama administration, and the Trump administration. In each administration, we have tried to reshape, change the tenor of the relationship, right-size the relationship, what have you. We've tried a lot of different things. I think the one lesson that we've learned is you cannot change the strategic calculus of Pakistan. I mean, you can't change it of most countries, but definitely not of Pakistan, as Ambassador Hale alluded to. No amount of carrots or sticks is going to change that. And so we really do need to be honest about the areas where we have convergence and the areas where we have divergences. And for the last 2 decades, as other speakers have said, the US-Pakistan relationship has been dominated by the war in Afghanistan, but also by US concerns about terrorism and nuclear security within Pakistan, persistent friction between India and Pakistan, and growing Chinese influence. So all of these have really shaped the last 20 years, I would argue, of US-Pakistan relationships. And while we've been ostensible allies in Afghanistan and at times have cooperated on a host of things, the misalignment of our strategic priorities has led to a lot of mistrust and strained relations on both sides. And so the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan, I think both Washington and Islamabad hope that it may be an opportunity to reframe US-Pakistan relationships. Pakistan would definitely like to see itself as a positive contributor to the Afghan peace process, and it wants to redefine bilateral relationships based on geoeconomics. The US is far more focused on strategic competition with China and increased strategic cooperation with India. So all of this to say, is there really space or political will for a renewed relationship? I think US policymakers are interested to see 2 things. One, how Pakistan is going to manage the US-China competition, given that it has strong relationships with both. Where does Pakistan see itself? And 2, of course, how is it going to use its relationship with the Taliban, either to continue to push for peace talks or political settlement? Will it exacerbate escalating violence in Afghanistan? I think US policymakers remain skeptical that Pakistan will be able to take a more positive trajectory. I think they believe it will remain mixed as it has in the last 2 decades. But I think there is also an acknowledgement that US national security interests are such that will not allow them to ignore Pakistan or not to build a strong relationship. So very briefly, I just want to touch on a few things that I think in the future will continue to dominate this relationship. I think as much as we want to put Afghanistan in the, in our rear view mirror, it's going to dominate the immediate term. And here, I think we should be focused on 2 things. One, the political settlement. I think this should remain our shared priority, despite fairly grim readouts of Tashkent over the last weekend. I think there is something there. There is a Pakistani willingness to help with the political settlement. This is the one place where the US and Pakistan have shared the most convergence, I would argue, over the last many years. Initially, US-Pakistan had a lot of differences about whether the US should talk to the Taliban, whether there should be a peace settlement. We were all about talk and fight. There were disagreements on the shape of the table and the topics, definitely in the Obama administration. In the last 2 years of the Trump administration, once we decided to give up the leverage of US troops, there was more alignment in the US willing to talk directly to the Taliban. And I would argue that the political process in Afghanistan has mirrored the US-Pakistan relationship. So when peace talks go well, the US-Pakistan relationship tends to be much better. And when they're going poorly, the US-Pakistan relationship is poor. I think we need to work closely with the Pakistanis to see where there is space for some sort of political settlement. This is the only way that we can avoid, complete chaos, complete civil war. I mean, the situation is already fairly poor in Afghanistan, as we all know. But whether it's interim government, peace negotiation, mediated talks, this is the way we can stem the violence, protect civilians, and get the region actually aligned. I think it's important to acknowledge what Ambassador Hale said, that we have to be realistic about the leverage that the Pakistanis have. It is not this full ability to control and bring the Taliban. Next on Afghanistan, I do want to touch on security cooperation. In my career, I worked a lot on security cooperation. You know, while we may want to move beyond that, in a post-US withdrawal situation, the security threats to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the region are only going to increase. And here I'm talking beyond the Taliban. If we're looking at emboldened groups like ISKP, remnants of AQ, and the resurgence of TTP, these are an area where the US and Pakistan do share interest in preventing these groups from wreaking havoc in the region. You know, Pakistan is relatively safe. It is not the days when I served as a political officer, you know, in the Red Mosque days, SWAT, all TNSM. Pakistan domestically is much, much safer and doesn't have that domestic terrorist attacks of that era. And I don't think anyone in the US or Pakistan wants to return to that. And so addressing these security concerns may be a place where we can find some convergence. My next point, I would really, you know, while Afghanistan is our immediate concern, in the near term, I think we will be dealing with Pakistan through a China lens. China-US competition is a bipartisan, across the board issue. This is not something that's going to go away. And India and our strategic alliance with India is the reality, right? So how do we actually shape a productive Pakistan relationship in that? And when you talk to Pakistanis, they will be very honest and say China is the compulsion, but they continue to want to have a positive relationship with the United States. And this, I think, applies to many countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia, that you cannot wish away their relationship with China. They're economically and security ties that they cannot remove. And I think addressing that in a honest fashion with the Pakistanis will be necessary if we want to build a further US-Pakistan relationship. And lastly, I just want to comment on some of the strains, right, in the new US-Pakistan relationship. I do think building those ties, as Nadia talked about, are important. When I served as a political officer, I lived in G6, I lived in F7, I traveled the length and breadth of the country, went to Quetta, opened a Lincoln corner in DI Khan. You just don't get out like that as a political officer. And I think that is very important in terms of building relationships. I think we should also acknowledge the PTSD from the last 20 years on both sides. In Islamabad and in Washington, there is distrust, there is anger, there's a lot of misunderstanding. And I don't think we can actually, you know, people say, let's start with a clean slate. I don't think that's actually possible. I think we have to acknowledge that the 20 years in Afghanistan have really shaped our views of each other and our public views. You know, publics in both countries have negative perceptions of the other. And I would argue the Hill, the executive branch, all of these pervade. When you have most people have served in Afghanistan, whether in our military or Hill staffers, their perception of Pakistan is negative because of that experience. And I think until we deal with that and talk through some of these, the strain and the distrust, we won't be able to move on. I think right sizing the relationship is the buzzword in Washington. That has been the buzzword. We talked about that in the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and the Trump administration. But I want to be honest, that means less attention. And that is where the ship is headed, right? As there's less attention on Afghanistan, there will also be less attention on Pakistan. And what we don't want is that we know Pakistan's too important to ignore, and we're just waiting for the next crisis to pay attention to Pakistan, right? So yes, right-sizing the relationship is important, but when is it that we're ignoring the relationship and we just stumble upon the next crisis? Geoeconomics is the word of the day in Islamabad, and it is the thing that the Pakistanis want to define our relationship by. I think one, that will not be done solely from the USG. That really depends on business to business relationships, people to people relationships. But it really depends on the political reforms and economic reforms within Pakistan. And I think we need to be honest, rather than painting a very rosy picture that yes, we're all geoeconomics. Let's be honest, the security relationship will remain important, and we support geoeconomics to the extent that we can encourage companies to invest in Pakistan. Lastly, I just want to end on this note that, you know, people often talk about this transactional versus strategic relationship. And as many other diplomats have argued, all of our relationships with many countries around the world are a mix of transactional and strategic. There's no way you can have a purely strategic relationship with a country where we have a lot of divergent interests. That being said, reviving something like the strategic dialogue is not going to be the solution, right? I worked on the strategic dialogue in 3 administrations, and in 3 administrations, it failed because at that level, at that ministerial or secretarial level, there just is not enough attention. I think we really need to work at building relationships, whether at the assistant secretary level, a DAS level, a level where we can actually do work together rather than trumpeting what we like to call the flags and flowers of the strategic dialogue, but we don't actually make a lot of progress. So I would say it's going to be a mix of transactional and strategic, but at the same time, let's work on some of the fundamental things where we have convergence rather than raising expectations and creating more distrust in the relationship. Back to you, Michael.
Well, thanks a lot, Tamanna. Really appreciated those comments, and I'm happy that you specifically brought in the geopolitical picture. And one of the things I'd like to discuss is what are the options for this relationship, given the realities, the immovable realities of strong U.S.-India partnership and strong Pakistan-China relationship. The question of how to find space for the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, given those constraints, I think is an important point. So thank you. Before we get to our discussion and questions, let's go to James Schwemlein. So James, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Michael. So my name is James Schwemlein. I'm a senior director at Albright Stonebridge Group. We are a global strategy and commercial diplomacy firm. I'm also affiliated at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And like the rest of the panelists in this U.S.-Pakistan therapy session, I am also a recovering U.S. government employee. I was with the State Department for a long time as a senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. At the World Bank, after that, I also did quite a bit of work on China's role in South Asia. So I'm going to cover 3 points briefly, and then we can get to discussion. The first is I want to go back at the point of the Afghanistan withdrawal being a reset or an opportunity for reset or right sizing of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. Afghanistan wasn't a priority before for the United States. That's one of the reasons why the United States is in the position that it's in. It hasn't been a priority for quite a long time. We had intermittent periods of focus. And that problem, that challenge is one of the reasons why for the bilateral U.S.-Pakistan relationship, the adverse effect of the withdrawal is, I would say, fairly minimal, and the effect overall is fairly marginal as well. For U.S.-Pakistan relations, as Tamanna said, as Ambassador Hale said, the security situation in the region is the primary feature. Whether or not the United States in Pakistan, especially since given the presence, what the presence has been since 2014, is not a primary element of determining the relationship. It was a challenge to manage. It caused friction points related to access and specific security incidents, but especially since 2014 and the decisions we made prior to that, this change has already been baked into the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. I think the better way of conceiving the way forward is that we've been bracketing this region, buffering it from basically global foreign policy trends. We've treated the Afghan war as kind of an ancillary task in a global picture, and it was a very important one on the counterterrorism agenda, and it became less important as counterterrorism became less of a driver of global U.S. foreign policy. Pakistan was looped into that Afghanistan-Pakistan theater. What we're doing now is we're changing the bracketing. Pakistan has an opportunity, less because the U.S. government says so, and more because of the actions it chooses to take, to become a different, have a different type of relationship and a different type of position in the way both the U.S., NATO allies, and the kind of broader set of G7 countries, I would say G7 and G20 countries, conceive of it in the world. And that comes down to the geoeconomic agenda that we hear so much about from Islamabad. These choices are choices, as Tamanna said a moment ago, that Pakistan can make that no one else can make. No one is going to make a relationship with Pakistan about geoeconomics. Pakistan is going to set that term in its behaviors and in its actions. Just in recent days, we've seen reminders of the bad old days that Tamanna just referenced in terms of local security in Pakistan, this abduction of the Afghan ambassador's daughter from Islamabad, this terrible security incident at the Dasu Dam, which is a World Bank financed dam being implemented by Chinese contractors. These are, and there's been a range of security incidents, particularly the hotel attack in Quetta 2 months ago, that have reminded, I think, Pakistanis in the world of the downside of a security deterioration. If that is the trajectory of the relationship, there's not going to be, and the trajectory of the security situation in the region, there's not going to be an opportunity for change in U.S.-Pakistan relations. If security conditions improve, if we can help them to improve, I would say, although the U.S. isn't a driver of Pakistan's security condition domestically, there's an opportunity for change. To the point about China, I think Pakistan finds itself in an interesting area of opportunity. We see this commercially, talking to US, European, East Asian firms, that Pakistan is a country with access that spans the 3 largest economic centers in the world: Europe, the United States, and China. There are a decreasing number of countries that have high levels of access in all 3 of those areas. The reality of the increasing scale of US-China competition and the bifurcation, of the kind of divorcing of some elements of the global economy because of a focus on supply chain resilience and security, has led to this situation where companies are feeling under stress. Pakistan is a place, or could conceivably be a place, where a company could have access to Europe under the generalized system of preferences plus, to the United States, which remains a very open economy despite turbulence in recent years over US trade policy, and to China, which has a what I would say a relatively low quality free trade agreement with Pakistan from a perception of an economic analysis, but it's still significant access to compared to what frankly the United States enjoys the Chinese market from a tariff regime perspective. There are fewer barriers to access today than for Pakistan to export to China than there are in many other cases in the world. Pakistan can take advantage of that. Again, that's choices for them to make. But it's from a positioning perspective, they're at a moment of choice. And the last thing I'd say on what I come away from my U.S. government experience with is that we suffered and suffer from a tyranny of false objectives. I also say what Tamanna said a moment ago, which is that I worked on many U.S.-Pakistan strategic dialogues, and it was a failure. Well, the problem is we didn't know what we were trying to do, frankly. And I think we had good top 5 lists, top 10 lists of our core meeting objectives, but really, we didn't have a clear target in mind. Kerry Lugar Merman, we had an idea, a persuasive idea. We want idea I continue to believe in, that the best way forward for U.S.-Pakistan relations is a civilian relationship, a relationship based not on governments or security services, but based on people and business and commerce. That continues to be the right idea. Taking a government-centered approach to that is the wrong tool to achieve the right objective. So I would say it's not just, right sizing is kind of a crude way of putting it. That's the term we've certainly used over the years. I would think about this way forward more as identifying the narrow convergence points and building on them. In other conversations, We've talked about things like counter-piracy as an area where the US military and the Pakistani Army and Navy could continue to move forward, where the US could continue to supply and equip and train alongside Pakistan military. I think there are likely other areas. That area, that spectrum is going to be restricted. Those spectrums of security overlap are going to become more restricted in the coming years. It doesn't mean the relationship is going to go away. And so I think the other part of having realistic objectives and narrow objectives is avoiding hysteria. And too much of the U.S.-Pakistan roller coaster that we've all been on has been driven by hysteria over the years. So I see significant, people-to-people commercial opportunity with Pakistan. I see significant continuing engagement between our governments, but aid isn't going to drive the terms of that relationship is going to be, whether it's security or economic. It can be a useful tool, but it's not going to be the center of it. Neither will the specific, whether it's a single business transaction or a single conference that governments hold. I always like that the geoeconomics conferences in Islamabad tend to occur with generals on the stage. That's not a vision of business, of a business-centered view of the world. So I would just say that in conclusion that we need narrow expectations and we need aligned expectations. And if we can prosecute as governments those narrow tasks, we can kind of create space for the rest of the relationship to go forward, irrespective of what the two governments are dealing with in the moment.
Thanks a lot, James. Really appreciate those opening comments and particularly your emphasis on, I guess, what I would describe as the need to right-size the expectations for the relationship and to be modest in scope. Thanks a lot. So really appreciate the four of you for those comments. If you in the audience would like to pose a question, please email it to asia@wilsoncenter.org, or you can tweet it to our Asia program handle, which is @Asia program. And we've already gotten questions, which I'll get to in a moment. I'll ask a few though, just to get things going. And I'd invite any of you who would like to weigh in to please do so. I do want to focus initially on Afghanistan because it seems like there's a consensus here that Afghanistan will continue to remain a focus of the relationship, at least in the immediate term. So I guess my question would be, what are some of the things that we should be watching for in Afghanistan that could give us a sense of where the U.S.-Pakistan relationship may be going? Now, I know that Tamanna and perhaps some others had highlighted the issue of the intra-Afghan dialogue, and this being an area where the U.S. and Pakistan do see eye to eye to an extent and should focus on working together in that regard. But what if we come to a point where that intra-Afghan dialogue process has collapsed, or if it's simply not taking off? Is that something that could start to have implications for the U.S.-Pakistan relationship? That's just one thought. So, so that would be the first question to you all. What are some markers, or what are some things that we should be looking for in the coming weeks and months in Afghanistan that might give us a sense as to what the trajectory of this relationship might be? Anyone want to weigh in on that?
I'm happy to, Michael. I mean, I see it in two parts. One, obviously, the intra-Afghan dialogue and stemming the violence in Afghanistan, getting the Taliban into some sort of political settlement or interim government or what have you, whatever the end state looks like. I think whether or not Pakistan actually has the leverage, we will continue to look to Pakistan for some leverage, right? I think there's an argument to be made how much actual influence Pakistan retains with the Taliban. And I think it spans, right? In Kabul, you're going to hear that they have complete control and this violence is being sent forward by the Pakistanis. On the other extreme, you're going to hear that, well, now that the Taliban doesn't need the safe haven, it's moved into Afghanistan, that the Pakistanis have far less leverage. I would argue it's somewhere in the middle, that it's still a mix. But that being said, I think Washington will continue to look to Pakistan to use whatever leverage it has, whatever influence it has to get the Taliban to the negotiating table. And many in Pakistan and the US might argue that the current battlefield posture that the Taliban is taking is to improve their negotiating hand, right? It's to give them a better position once they actually get to the negotiating table. Hopefully that's the case. I mean, many may argue that they can probably win a lot of space, but they can't take Kabul and hold Kabul. So their best bet is to actually use the military gains to negotiate a better position for themselves in the outcome. I think what's really important here are a couple of things. One, internally, political leaders in Afghanistan are already cutting separate deals with the Taliban, right? They are negotiating, whether you call them warlords or what have you. Different leaders are making accommodations with the Taliban, as are countries in the region. And so I think what's important in the U.S.-Pakistan relationship will be how the U.S. and Pakistan can work together with the regional countries and the different Afghan players to come to some sort of political agreement and have people united. Otherwise, you have everyone moving in different ways in a disconcerted, disparate way, including the regional players, because they aren't unified under whether it's the UN or even, the Troika Plus banner. It's not really bringing everyone together. And in that sense, you're not going to get to a political settlement that brings you any modicum of stability. One point on this, I think there will come a need for the US to exert pressure on the Afghan government to accept some sort of deal, right? If all the readouts that we're getting are to be believed, then there's still a hesitation or pushback from the Afghan government to be engaged in in a real way to some sort of negotiated settlement with the Taliban. I mean, obviously it's not all in their hands, but I think the US will definitely need to weigh in there. I think the second thing is security, as we talked about. All of the other militant groups are going to be, James raised plenty of the harrowing security incidents that are happening. They are coming into Pakistan. They will also be affecting Indo-Pac. I mean, whether they affect the situation in Kashmir. I mean, we really need to, it's an evolving situation, but we will need to be focused with the Pakistanis on shared security threats. And I think there's plenty of them that we have convergence on. And so we should be focused on whether it's TTP, ISKP, or AQ.
Thanks. James, I know you wanted to weigh in. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I wanted to circle back to something Ambassador Hale said in his opening remarks, and that is the desire and the likelihood that the Pakistan's army will look to local small-scale security understandings to stabilize the frontier. And I think that's right. I completely agree with that assessment. My question, and this is a question for the whole group, and I'm not sure of my view of it. Is it really, as the security situation deteriorates in Afghanistan, the parts of Afghanistan that the United States is worried about, fears about, in terms of whether it's from a terrorism perspective or regional security perspective, really are all more or less already under the control of the Taliban. I mean, I'd welcome a more sophisticated analyst like Tamanna to kind of verify that, but it kind of looks from 7,500 miles away like that's the case. That even today, the Taliban control most of the territory that the United States is at most risk about. So the question is, are we at some point in the next couple of years going to share that preference that Ambassador Hale raised, I think rightly, that the Pakistan Army already has?
Did anyone else want to weigh in before we go on? Okay. Sort of a related question, actually, this comes from the audience, to this issue of the US and Pakistan looking at the how to focus on the intra-Afghan dialogue. I think it was Ambassador Hale earlier that had talked about if there's something that's presented to Pakistan and it would go against its interest to act otherwise, no manner of carrots or sticks will get it to do otherwise, which I would certainly agree with. But to that point, we did have a question that asks that with the US withdrawal and less reliance of the US on supply routes from Pakistan to its troops in Afghanistan, would there be any prospect for more pressure from the US on Pakistan for supporting the Afghan peace process? That was the question. based on what Ambassador Hale said earlier, I assume that at least one of you would say no, but I want to invite anyone else or Ambassador Hale or anyone to weigh in on that further if you'd like.
Well, Michael, why don't I take a stab? I really do hold strongly to the belief that language of pressure just doesn't work in Pakistan. It doesn't work in a lot of places. There has to be a convergence of interests. Certainly, certain costs need to be spelled out, and the costs have to be strategic, not things the United States can extract. So if we in the Pakistans are together convinced that a deteriorating security situation, for example, in Afghanistan requires certain actions by Pakistan, then we're likely to get somewhere. And then it would be justifiable for us to provide the assistance needed for Pakistan to play that role. So the aid should be viewed as an instrumentality rather than a means of changing policy. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you. And just to clarify, Ambassador Hale, because I think you had said something earlier that is pretty significant. Just want to make sure that we all understood it correctly. Had you said that the U.S. has never sought basing agreements or basing arrangements with Pakistan or U.S. troops on the ground? Is that what you had said earlier?
That's right. I mean, in this chapter of dealing with the the ZAL's negotiation, the decision by President Biden reaffirmed to withdraw troops, there's been no discussion, to my knowledge, and no consideration of giving even thought to basing in Pakistan. Over.
Well, thank you. Let's now get into the geopolitical story. And I think it was so important that several of you brought up the China factors and the India factors, which have to be discussed in the context of any conversation about the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. Let's dig a bit deeper on this issue of how can the two countries find space, political capital, bandwidth, and just space in general to cooperate against those constraints of the fact that the US and Pakistan both have close ties to the other's main rival. And here I wanted to cite something that Ambassador Cameron Munter, who of course is another former US ambassador to Pakistan, said in an event some months ago. He said that the Biden administration appears keen to cooperate multilaterally on shared global threats, and that there could be space for the US and Pakistan to work together in these areas. And some of these include things like climate change, combating climate change, cybersecurity, public health. I think someone earlier mentioned the issue of piracy as an issue to look at. So are these issues that are sort of viable, realistic areas for cooperation? And sort of the related question to that is, do you think it's more likely to see the US and Pakistan cooperating on those types of issues in multilateral settings, more so than bilateral settings? And the reason I ask, as many of you will know, just the other day, there was this new agreement that the US signed with Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan, some type of diplomatic agreement meant to promote cooperation and regional connectivity, which is interesting. It's a case of the US and Pakistan working together with some other countries. So just want to sort of invite anyone that would like to weigh in to what are the bounds and the possible parameters of cooperation within the constraints of the China factors, the India factors, and to the extent that you could have that type of cooperation on those broader non-security issues, is it more realistic to think it could happen within multilateral and bilateral settings?
Can I go at that for a second? What's interesting about the US and Pakistan on multilateral issues is, except for the very major problem of our mutual perspectives on nuclear issues, that we tend to be in convergence on issues in the World Trade Organization, or largely on issues related to climate change under this administration, and other multilateral fora as well. The issue is, I think, one, that the United States prioritizes the countries who bring the most votes with them in these negotiations. That certainly is true in the WTO context. India gets a lot of attention because India is a problem in the WTO. Pakistan doesn't get much attention because Pakistan is generally shares many of our preferences in the trade context. In the climate fora context, I would have recommended at the very beginning of this administration that rather than Imran Khan kind of waiting for someone to pick up the phone, that the prime minister should have picked up the phone himself and called the climate envoy, Secretary Kerry, and engaged to set the terms of the relationship and set a focus that was non-security, if that was the preference that his system wanted to drive. It's not as if that would have been, he can argue that that somehow rank was an issue. President Putin just spoke to climate envoy Kerry last week. So I think we can do many things with will and intent. But ultimately, I think Pakistan has relevant, particularly on the climate agenda, has relevance and could assert its relevance globally by being a leader among developing nations ahead of Oslo, or ahead of Glasgow, I'm sorry.
Thanks. So Nadia, please go ahead.
I would just say briefly that these are all areas that take a lot of political capital to change in Pakistan. And what I've seen in Pakistan is that to actually change, climate or even cybersecurity, privacy, those things take a lot of political capital and focus at a high level from the government. And a mistake that we've made is us predetermining priorities of things that we think need to change in an ideal world in Pakistan, and two, expecting to be able to tackle all of them at once. So for example, the change that we have seen in education in Pakistan has been because, in Punjab, Shahbaz Sharif personally put a lot of political capital into that area. He couldn't simultaneously change governance for 10 areas at the same time. So yeah, if it's going to happen, it's going to take political capital on their side. It's going to take political capital on our side. And it has to be an area that is a priority to the government, which is currently under a lot of stress domestically. So economically, as well as security-wise now.
Michael, if I can chime in, I think it's important to acknowledge that the U.S.-China strategic competition is not like the old Cold War. It is not a zero-sum game. And I think that there is a realization of that in the Biden administration and in Washington. But to actually carve out a space for a U.S.-Pakistan relationship, I think it's easy without proactive attention on the relationship for us to drift into those blocks, right? While we are not seeing this through that zero-sum lens, and we understand that countries are going to have ties with both the U.S. and China, I think given Pakistan's security, technology, economic ties, without real attention to the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, it's very easy for it to sort of inertia to take Pakistan closer and closer to China, and I don't see that Washington, there's some hope that Washington might be able, when we talk about BRI or CPEC, and they're like, so what is the US replacement for that? And there is no US replacement. And I don't think the US is trying to replace or try to compete with CPEC in any way. And I think that those are important facts for us to acknowledge. I would also concur with Nadia's point that many of the reforms that we want for this geoeconomics are just politically untenable in Pakistan. We have to realize that the elite resistance and the political structures that keep some of these economic obstacles in place are not going to go away. So is there something besides the full reform that we can work with that makes it useful and attractive to US investment?
Thank you. And I think that's a very important point that you make about how we should distinguish this current US-China strategic competition from Cold War era rivalry. I find in my own exchanges with Pakistani officials and Pakistani commentators, this belief or perspective that the US is, quote, trying to contain China, which brings back Cold War terms. I've always thought that the term counterbalance is a better term. At any rate, on that topic of China and the US-China-Pakistan triangle, Prime Minister Khan, some days ago or several weeks ago, he suggested, or he appeared to suggest, that there is pressure on Pakistan from the United States to effectively choose a side between working with the US or working with China. And some have pushed back against that, including myself, whether that pressure is indeed happening. But I just wanted to know if any of you wanted to respond to that claim that Prime Minister Khan had made.
Yeah, I would, Michael, agree with you. In my time in Pakistan and subsequently as undersecretary, I saw this from two administrations and briefly in the Biden administration. And that was not in any way the perspective of any of those leaders had very different approaches. The nature of Pakistan, the Pakistani-Chinese relationship is something that's basically accepted. We're not going to compete with it. We're not trying to compete with it. We think that it's probably the geostrategic benefits of it are probably exaggerated by some Pakistanis, but that's their decision and their right to make choices and alliances that they want. I do think it's important to bear in mind that the CPEC investments had a lot to do with excess Chinese capital trying to find some place to go and employing Chinese laborers rather than Pakistani workers. And there are a lot of second thoughts that are being given in Pakistan today on the level on how CPEC unfolded. But again, I don't think it's valuable for the Americans officials to opine on that. That's for Pakistan. If in the end, Chinese investment helps to build a stronger, better governed, more prosperous Pakistan, that's advantageous to the United States as well. And so I would be focused on that. We're not trying to compete. We don't see that. In my experience, no administration has seen it in those terms. Over.
I would completely agree with that. The other element is if, while we would love, our businesses would love to be the ones building roads and bridges and power plants in Pakistan, we would prefer that there be commercial processes for this project. And by the way, we think that that would be also in the interest of the Pakistani government and people. That's all fine. It doesn't mean that U.S. businesses can't benefit from better power or better access or better transportation. I think I've always said about the Belt and Road Initiative in general, globally, this is not the way we do business. It doesn't mean we're not going to drive on the roads that are built. This is not the end of the game. This is just one step.
I think also with China, I mean, it dwarfed the United States in terms of money, but it wasn't just that. It was also that it was easy to get that money. And at the time that CPEC came into Pakistan, it was after decades of frustration that Pakistani officials have had with traditional Western donors. The comments that people made to me about the IMF and how, cycle after cycle of highly paid consultants come in and they do studies and it takes years. And even at the time, Dimer Basha Dam was under another study, to see if we can make the case to the ADB to support it. And this kind of goes on and on and on and on. And, China comes in and very easily, here you go, because they're seeing it from an investment lens. Therefore, it's easier. But it also, so I think that again points to the need for us to reform the tools of foreign policy if they are going to be effective and help us in our relationships with countries. And that's not something that should be overlooked and siloed to just, a development aid niche kind of thing. And secondly, China also, what China wanted to do aligned very neatly with the priorities of politicians in Pakistan. Infrastructure is good for elections, regardless of any economic analysis that you do on the particular projects, and that's why it worked. So I think there are things to be learned there, even if going into the future, the money that we bring to the table is been dwarfed by China.
Well, thank you. A few quick questions related to economics and investment. The first one I open up to all of you. The next one is directly addressed to Nadia. So, but in terms of the first one, to what is the impact of China's closeness to Pakistan on Western investment in Pakistan and Western investor perceptions of investment in Pakistan? And the related question to that is are there any prospects for reconstruction opportunity zones, ROZs, in Pakistan? Of course, this is something that had been discussed a lot in prior years, not as much recently. So anyone want to address those questions?
I might offer a few thoughts. I don't know how many Western businessmen pay attention to Pakistan at all, to be honest with you. To the extent that they do, I think that they're looking at the whole picture and then at their sector. And it's not right now anyway, a very appealing picture. The way China conducts its business there, it contributes to that. And certainly there's a lack of transparency in how contracts are awarded, not just the primary contract, but on down secondary and tertiary. Even Pakistani businesses are cut out. They don't join the chambers of commerce. They don't go through the normal processes like everybody else. So that's a problem. But I think for an American, a Western businessman, is going to look at the whole picture there. And I think the geo-economic idea is a great one. But as Tamanna said, Pakistanis have to do a lot to make the country attractive, a good place to do business before that strategy is going to pay off. Because what the United States offers is the private sector. We do not offer, as James said, the Chinese model. It's not going to be that way. It's going to be very different. In the long run, I think hugely beneficial to a country with enormous untapped human potential. Because our model will involve employment for Pakistanis. Our model will bring dollars to employ Pakistanis there and to serve a Pakistani market, which is not what I see happening with the Chinese. So I think that is the wider spectrum to look at, and not the narrow but important issue of China. Over.
Yeah, I think that's all right. So in the general, the U.S. corporate profile in Pakistan today are companies that serve Pakistani consumers. It's manufacturing for domestic use. In some instances, like textiles, U.S. firms place orders, and those are for export. They're manufactured locally and exported to the United States. Generally, it's not that has not been the focus of investment in the past. China's model is literally the opposite of that. Now it started with basically Chinese money going to Chinese firms to construct Chinese roads, right? I mean, it was kind of all the way down the line. And now it's starting to morph into things like Huawei opening its regional headquarters in Karachi, or Alibaba buying a e-commerce company and having currently the dominant e-commerce platform in the country. That's a morph. That's a change in the way China is doing business over the last 7 years. Going forward, I think the real opportunity for U.S. business is judged not by who is in the market, by what are the rules? Can money go in safely? Are they going to be bribed to get business license? Are they going to be extorted to get business licenses? Are they going to be able to get their capital out at the end? Are they going to be able to achieve the returns that they want? There's a good record, actually, of repatriation of capital from Pakistan, from U.S. businesses, but there are questions about the first two parts of that kind of process, and obviously there are many other links in the chain that need to be worked on. But is it a priority? I agree with Ambassador Hale. U.S. businesses are only interested in Pakistan insofar as they can achieve returns there. And the U.S. government has very little ability to affect that calculus. Doesn't mean it can't, raise the profile of Pakistan. It doesn't mean it can't encourage, help Pakistani businesses come here. But ultimately, it's going to be more of a business-driven question. On ROZs, I'll just say briefly, trade preferences are an irrelevance in this relationship.
Michael, I can just add my 2 cents. I agree with everything Ambassador Hale and James said. I mean, having worked on the previous ROZs under Carrie Lugar-Berman, and I mean, James is right. I mean, these ROZs aren't going to help. They're not going to work. When we tried ROZs in the FATA, I mean, Pakistani companies wouldn't even show up. So, I mean, we should be very clear-eyed. A lot of times these sound like really great ideas, and we just need to be very clear-eyed about what will actually work. I would say, in talking to people, definitely manufacturing, commodities, those type of things are the traditional businesses, or energy, LNG companies are looking at Pakistan, but also new media and tech sector, whether they are very much looking at the big youth population in Pakistan, English speaking, a lot of media and content creation. So there is the capacity and the possibility of that. I think it just hasn't been tapped into. So Netflix is not tapping into the music and the movies and the dramas that are made in Pakistan. And there are many reasons to that. I think one is the ease of doing business, and as James pointed out, some of the structural obstacles to getting businesses in there and whether they're going to make a profit. But I also think what adds to this is, and this is a trend across South Asia, is media suppression, freedom, censorship, that space does also affect whether new media companies will come into it. But lastly, I would say that there is a perception issue that Pakistan has to work on, and that I think the USG can help to some extent, but can't shift. You know, we have countries like, for example, Bangladesh, which has a worse record in terms of, if you look at the numbers on ease of doing business than Pakistan. And yet there are many more US companies invested in Bangladesh. And I would say some of it has to do with marketing and the perception of security in a country, the perception on the US relationship with that country. But moreover, it has to do with how much exposure. And I think that's where Pakistan can work in a business to business way to get exposure.
Thank you. Ambassador Hale, it looked like you wanted to say something quickly, and then I wanted to go to Nadia, the question for her.
I just wanted to make an observation building on something James said earlier, which is that, you know, Pakistan geographically is a crossroads, and that's its history, as everyone knows, going back to ancient times. A lot of politics, a lot of insecurity has prevented that Pakistan from taking advantage of that today. But I think that's an area to see as a goal, is to work for trying to create relations with neighbors so that Pakistan can go back to being the benefit of a trading nexus, which in itself could begin to attract perhaps American business, certainly European and others, to make investments there if they could use it as a platform for the region. Back to you.
Thanks, that's a fair point, a very good point. So a specific question directed to Nadia. You mentioned that US aid to Pakistan, especially regarding education reform, did not produce the substantial results we expected. And going off of Ambassador Hale's comment on the Pakistani leadership's perspective on the US is somewhat unreliable in some cases, how should US diplomats approach establishing a stronger partnership with Pakistan while ensuring the aid goes to the right places and as China's presence in the country grows? So Nadia, do you want to respond to that?
So I would rely less on money, like I said, and I think like a lot of what aid has done over the past many years, like I said, is very technically sound. But I think we need to take what we learned and make it part of the political conversation around these areas in Pakistan. So even with China, for example, the energy projects are facing a problem in terms of Pakistan's aging transmission lines. You can build all you want in terms of power plants, but at the end of the day, you know, the way that Pakistan is distributing, using its budget to continue to operate any sector is very focused on jobs. And that's what's draining the budgets. And a lot of public infrastructure is overstaffed with non-performing employees. The US has done a lot of work in these areas, but it's kind of lost in paperwork. And I think that we, at some point, should find a way, and if it's not in Pakistan, then in other places, to take what we learned and kind of escalate it to the conversation with politicians at the highest levels. And this is how DFID and the World Bank have been part of change, say in education, in the provinces in Pakistan. This is how they work. They don't rely on their money alone, but they use their political leverage as well to get governance to strengthen in ways that it needs to happen. I think another thing is that we need to recognize that change does happen and understand how it happens. So when it comes to, and there's a lot of concerns about girls' education in Afghanistan and what's going to happen over there as a result of our withdrawal. We need stability first. Afghanistan needs stability, Pakistan needs stability. But after that, at some point, there is the kind of counterbalance to the Taliban is what people want. It's people's demands, it's civil society. And there is a demand for girls' education, I believe, even in Afghanistan. And I can speak about KP, where despite what you hear, despite, you know, you hear about the Taliban, you hear about attacks on girls' schools, but there is a huge demand for girls' education in Pakistan. And Pew surveys will tell you that only 9% of Pakistanis believe that education is more important for boys than girls. So 91% of Pakistanis don't agree with the Taliban. And I think we make the mistake of thinking that if the Taliban takes over politically in any space, that they also dominate what people demand. And I think it's going to take time, but that there is a pushback that comes from people against what the Taliban will try to impose, and that's why they need violence. In Pakistan, sorry, in KP province, I'm not an expert on Afghanistan, but in KP province, where I have done a lot more analysis, the girls' enrollment in girls' high schools is beyond capacity. There are more girls that show up to take high school completion exams in Mardan, Abbottabad, and Peshawar than boys. The gender gap, I think, is more narrow than we think, but a lot of the problem is coming from a supply side issue of the lack of availability of girls' schools, of reasons related to affordability of schooling, and also female teachers. I interviewed Rula Ghani, the First Lady of Afghanistan, a few years ago, and she told me something similar about Afghanistan, and that's something very surprising that people found when they traveled around Afghanistan and spoke to people there, was the demand for girls' education. And that and I think in both places, people ask for girls' schools, but the big concern that they have is male teachers. In Afghanistan, that's what she told me, that, you know, parents, fathers will ask for girls' schools, but they want female teachers to be teaching girls for their safety. So I think we've missed a lot of opportunity through our failure of really understanding how change happens and where the opportunities are. And it's through better relationships with civil society, taking the time to really understand the places that we can see those opportunities. So yeah.
Thanks, Nadia. Really appreciate that very substantive response to what was really a very good but complex question. So thank you. So what I wanted to do in the really less than 15 minutes we have left, wanted to go back to a question on geopolitics and then wrap up with something that comes back to Afghanistan. So on the first question related to geopolitics, the Biden administration's main Asia policy is likely to be something very similar to, if not identical to, the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific policy. And you know, it's a policy that appears to be meant to counterbalance China's rise, and it's something that envisions India as a key partner, as well as the other Quad countries. So this sounds like a policy that really is not in Pakistan's favor. It doesn't seem to be one that can include Pakistan. But that said, what do you all think that this Asia policy means for U.S.-Pakistan relations? And, you know, is there any scope for the Development Finance Corporation, the Blue Dot Network, these new tools associated with the Indo-Pacific policy? Is there scope for these tools to be considered to be used to sponsor infrastructure projects in Pakistan? Is that an option, or is that essentially not realistic and we can expect these tools to be used to promote infrastructure investments in other countries beyond Pakistan? Did anyone want to respond to that?
Michael, I'd be happy to start. I would not expect these tools to be applicable to Pakistan. They're meant to bolster our strategies to offer alternatives to economies in the Indo-Pacific area to the Chinese model. I think Pakistan's already bought into the Chinese model so extensively that it would be not a great option and we wouldn't see many returns from providing these resources to Pakistan. Now, that is not to say that we are in any way abandoning our own interests in Pakistan, but I was just say those tools are meant for different audiences. Over.
If I can, so on the first part of the question about the conception of the Indo-Pacific and whether Pakistan is included, you know, Pakistan has always been on the other side of that kind of regional line from a U.S. kind of structural policymaking perspective. The Pacific Command, Central Command, you know, line is the India-Pakistan border, and in many ways the Indo-Pacific conception shared by the Trump administration and the Biden administration follows with that preference. That being said, it's not, again, these choices evolve, and I think one of the other things to note is foreign policy is about the entire world. We have a priority. As I said, Afghanistan wasn't a priority for the United States. It was kind of down the list over many years. It doesn't mean we didn't spend a lot of money and resources there, and it doesn't mean we didn't take casualties and risks there. We still took actions, even though it wasn't part of the core kind of set of priorities. Pakistan has potentially a lot to offer that it could offer, that it could use its agency to offer. I personally conceive of Pakistan less as an Asian economy than as a Middle East economy. In my experience, it's very closely linked with the Gulf countries for a lot of reasons, so it shouldn't be it shouldn't view as limiting necessarily how U.S. policy is articulated. But I do agree with Ambassador Hale that Washington has not conceived to date that Pakistan is part of the Indo-Pacific. That being said, there are already Development Finance Corporation supported political risk fund and debt and kind of activities in Pakistan through a variety of instruments, and there will be going forward. When we make decisions, we prioritize, and it's about budgetary envelope. It's not about lack of budget. So it doesn't mean, again, there are resources and through these institutions are being preferenced to the Indo-Pacific. It doesn't mean we're not active everywhere else.
Well, thank you. Thanks, James. So as we start to close here, perhaps it's fitting that we come back to Afghanistan, just because this is going to be on the mind of the relationship, at least for the foreseeable future. A lot of questions from the audience about Afghanistan. One of them, or actually several of them relate to the issue of refugees and the impact of the U.S. withdrawal on refugee flows as that affects Pakistan. How much of a threat is that? And is there a way for the US and Pakistan to cooperate in dealing with that very real concern? And the other question, there were a very large number of questions on these, which I think is significant. The impact of the US withdrawal on Afghan girls and women in Afghanistan. To what extent is there grounds for US-Pakistan cooperation on that? So anyone want to weigh in on either of those queries? Yes, go ahead, Tamanna.
Sure, Michael, I can start off. I think refugees and internally displaced persons are already becoming a huge issue, right? So people who have resources within Afghanistan are leaving Afghanistan, and those who don't are being internally displaced. I think as things get worse, and if there is no agreement, no political resolution, you're only going to see this get worse. And it becomes, obviously the pressure is on neighboring states like Iran, like Pakistan and others. Pakistan has made very clear that it is thinking about these things. They haven't come down with a final decision. One of the things that they're saying, which I think would be very dangerous, is a complete, using the fencing of the border to stop all refugee flows. I don't think that's really tenable. It's not something the US would like Pakistan to do, obviously. And so I think this is one of the things the Defense Department and others have raised as one of their key issues that they need to engage with Pakistan on. And so we need a lot more focus. Some of the ideas coming out of Pakistan, obviously the strictest one is this fencing and let them stay in camps on the Afghan side of the border. And the Pakistanis have said they could be UN camps. The other thing is what they call the Iran model, which is on the Pakistani side, have very strict refugee camps that don't allow Afghans to come into the rest of Pakistan. I just think in practice, these are all very difficult. I mean, the history of Afghan refugees in Pakistan is a long one and a varied one. It's not a monolith, right? You have people in very different places. You obviously have large camps outside of Peshawar, outside of Quetta, but you also have people who live with relatives, with other people, move into cities. And I think this is going to be an issue that the US and Pakistan will have to work on. This is not going to be a simple solution for Pakistan. There's no way they can just contain all the Afghan refugees that they may face. On the second one of girls and women's education, I of course, this is going to be something that is, I don't have all the answers for you here, but I just want to raise some important issues here. In all our talks with the Taliban, this is something that was always on our talking points, obviously protection of women and girls and minorities, right? So what will be the case for these going forward? You know, one interesting thing, people talk about the Taliban having evolved. I think on these social issues, there may be some evolution. It's really on political issues where the Taliban haven't evolved, right? So we have to see this through a political lens. While they might, you know, there are plenty of daughters of Taliban who go to schools in Pakistan. It's not that they don't. And there were areas that were controlled by the by the Afghan Taliban within Afghanistan where girls did continue to go to school in northern areas and other, depending on, it wasn't a monolith, depending on the commander, depending on the need of the request of the people. I think this will be used as a political bargaining chip. And I think that is where it's dangerous. I think we need to look at that. You know, this, just like the bombing of the Buddhas, this is something that draws international attention. And the leverage we have here is the Taliban is still interested in international recognition. And I think that is an important reason why this needs to be part of a political negotiation.
Thanks. Anyone else want to weigh in on those questions? If not, oh, Nadia, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think that girls' education is a very difficult one to address because it's not purely ideological. There's an element to it that is ideological, but if you can separate it from insecurity, then I think there's space for even the Taliban to change their position on this. So, for example, one is for Pakistan, we see three challenges. One is male teachers in schools, and the public sector disproportionately hires men. So parents do not want to send girls to school for that reason. The distance to schools is another reason. So, and I think if you can establish, you know, the idea of like, okay, if a school is a safe space, it's close to girls' homes, it has a female teacher, and you only leave the ideological bit there, I think that can change. I think there's that space there.
I want to make one additional point, and there's really nothing about the set of decisions that the U.S. has made in Afghanistan over the years that kind of keeps me up at night personally than the kind of two issues that we're talking about here. The potential for, you know, another round of, and there are already 2.5 million Afghans living in neighboring countries, another round of significant refugee flows as a result of conflict displacement, and the kind of fate of women, girls, children, all Afghans really, as a result of this situation. But I do think we, you know, in the international community have agency in how we help here, and that's, I would just make a plea, and I've made another context and others, it's not an original point, that we also think about how our assistance can span conflict lines in Afghanistan going forward. In the recent statement that was issued by the Kabul government delegation and the Taliban in Doha over the weekend, and also in Tashkent, there were statements about the need to distribute COVID vaccines across conflict lines. There are ameliorative steps that the U.S., the international community can take to try to reduce the human cost of what is a brutal conflict, going to remain a brutal conflict. And we shouldn't, you know, just because the humans happen to be in areas that are already under the control of the Taliban, it doesn't mean they shouldn't have access to COVID vaccines or other vaccines for that matter.
And if I can have a two-finger on that, I think James' point is well taken, and we have evidence of this. I mean, we were able to do polio vaccines across battle lines, you know, in Taliban-controlled areas and in, you know, in Afghan government-controlled areas. This is something we have experience doing. Similarly with girls' schools, I think the more we make it a political issue, the harder it gets. There were girls' schools operating in Taliban-controlled areas, and I don't think we should forget that. I think we should hold them to doing that, and I don't think it's something that's impossible to do.
Absolutely, yeah, thanks to that. I think that's absolutely correct. We're going to have to wrap up, but before we do so, if anyone wants to give a 10-second response to one final question, that is, why has President Biden not had a phone call with Prime Minister Imran Khan? Would anyone like to give a 10-second response to that question? If not, that's fine. Oh yeah, go ahead, Nadia.
Oh, I wasn't going to say anything. I mean, it is interesting because, 10 years ago, Biden was very personally interested in Pakistan and believed on its own importance, that we had to engage with Pakistan. Besides China and India, one thing we haven't mentioned is that Pakistan has a very populist government. And of course, you can kind of understand perhaps why it hasn't happened yet, but that's the extent of my comment.
Well, thank you. My quick response would be that this being a transactional relationship probably would need to wait until there's something significant, something big to announce or discuss when you have President Biden speak to Prime Minister Khan. At any rate, wanted to thank all of you, Ambassador David Hale, Nadia Naviwalla, Tamanna Salikuddin, and James Schwemlein for joining us. This has been a terrific discussion. I really appreciate you providing a wonderful assessment of the U.S.-Pakistan relationship in the past moving forward, and I appreciate your willingness to draw on some lessons from your time in government to animate the debate. This really was a terrific discussion. This was a discussion drawing on U.S. perspectives on the relationship. In the coming weeks, you'll see the Wilson Center will be doing some programming with Pakistani perspectives on the relationship, so stay tuned for that. Thank you all again. Thank you for those of you in the audience for listening. You posed some great questions, which we really appreciate. And with that, we will adjourn. So thank you very much all, and take care and have a good night. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.